Welcome tonight. My name's Craig Ronan and I work for City Bible Forum that's putting on the event tonight. City Bible Forum is a national network of city workers, business people around Australia who are Christians who actually want to try and integrate their Christian faith with their work life. And one of the things we try and do is we think that the Christian faith is worth the scrutiny of the marketplace. And so events like tonight are a chance for us to get together and hear about something that we sometimes think of, depending on whether we've been retrenched or whatever, the idea of eternity, or whether we've been made for more. You don't really want to hear too much from me tonight. I did mention earlier, for those of you who just came in, there's a blank piece of paper inside the little handout tonight. You can write a question on that. Jonathan up the back here, true author, will come around with a blue box to put the questions in a little later. And we'd love to have your questions. If you want to find out more about who we are and what we do and other events we put on, there's also a little contact form there. Fill that in and give that to the registration desk when you leave. Thanks very much. I'll hand it over to the lovely Anita Savage.
Thanks, Craig. That gets us in the mood. Now, are we working? Not online yet?
Could you speak into the mic?
The microphone will be turned on. There we go.
Testing.
Now, dictionaries define eternity as endless time, and in a religious context, basically that means immortality, whereby death is conquered, people may live for an unlimited amount of time. Now, you may have seen the word eternity written on footpaths around the city over the last week or so.
Until it rained.
Until it rained, and that's been washed away, so you can hear about it tonight here, and the variety of ideas. Perhaps it has made you think about what is ahead for tomorrow, next week, round the corner, or at the end of our lives. And to discuss that, we have three gentlemen here. We have Dick Gross on my right, who's a freelance journalist, author and writer of the blog Godless Gross. On my left, we have Professor Salman Sayyid, who is the director of the Muslim Non-Muslim Centre at the University of South Australia. And on his left, we have Ian Powell, who is a Christian minister and who works closely with the
Isn't he the Reverend Ian Powell?
If you want to give titles. We'll see how reverend he is tonight. First of all, welcome everybody and welcome to the panel. Let's just start with a basic definition of what is eternity, what our various guests here consider the definition of eternity. Let's start with you, Ian. Just very briefly, eternity. What is it? Why do we care?
There are two ways to understand philosophers have spoken of. One is a relationship outside of time, and that would be the idea that for someone outside of time who is in eternity, say for example God, everything is in the now. What we see to be a series of sequential events, it's all present, so it's completely outside of time. The other way is to understand the way that you mentioned from the dictionary, that it's like when God says from everlasting to everlasting, he is God. And I think in the specific way that you set it up, I take it we're talking about life after death, that part, because we're obviously not from everlasting, but there is the potential, according to many, that we might endure long after death.
So from a Christian perspective, eternity is?
Well, it would be the life, I'm just picking a part of it because it says a few things. I think it would be the life with God which begins now and endures into time without end, or in the way it sums it, forever and ever and ever and ever. That's that. I guess that's what we're talking about. I think that's what Arthur Stace, when he began that writing, I think that's what he had in mind, that everyone has to face the fact, like it or not, believe it or not, we face eternity forever.
Professor Sayyid?
Yeah, I think in many ways the concept of eternity is not dissimilar. I think it gets mixed up with the infinite, the sense of what exceeds the human. Certainly in Islamic traditions, the idea of God as being eternal means someone who is timeless, therefore has no end, and also no beginning in a sense. The creator who is not created. So in a sense, it's a kind of a mixture of both the sense of time, but time also is made into something like space as well. But it's something that is just simply not conceivable in human terms as having any sense of finitude. And I think that's the most important aspect of it. And this is why it's always God, or the attributes of God, which are referred to as being eternal, because God is not of time. And I think that's kind of important.
Dick Gross, having heard those, what is your response? Eternity, does it exist?
Well, I can't believe in it. It may exist, but I don't believe in it. And that brings to mind two aphorisms, which I'll soon repeat, which deals with two different issues for the atheist. So the atheist doesn't have to grapple with the complexities of definition and construction that we've heard earlier, because as it said about the dead atheist on the mortician slab, the dead atheist is all dressed up and nowhere to go. And so it's quite intellectually simple for us. We can't believe, and so we don't. The consequences of that is one of potentially immeasurable pain and sorrow and anguish, because the tragedy of death is not defeated. The tragedy of death is all too stark and real. So the other aphorism I use to talk about the consequences of a failure to be able to believe in eternity is you don't find any atheists in a foxhole. So the consequences of unbelief are that we have to work through our own narrative to try and get some consolation in the face of death. And I don't think that's either intellectually easy or probably humanly possible. It's just a tragedy we cannot defeat.
You talk about consequences. Are there consequences for unbelief, apart from the fact that death is the end of life?
Well, that's a really important consequence, and because
if you're wrong.
If I'm wrong, well, what is it? Pascal's bet that wager that he would believe in God, because when you find out you're wrong, you're right, and so I don't take that wager because the paucity of my belief is so strong that I don't feel the need for that. Notwithstanding, that I'm strong in and firm in that belief and non-belief, I am cognizant of the appalling consequences of that.
Is the belief in a non-belief, as you put it, and the consequences, does that affect how you live your life? Because I'm sure Ian Powell and Professor Sayyid, your belief in an eternity will affect how you live your lives, or how people live their lives if they've got a belief.
Absolutely.
I think we have to be sort of slightly careful about this. If you take a very kind of scientific view and say something like the universe is 14 billion, the Big Bang happened about 14 billion years ago, I would say to you, everyone in that room, that's eternity. I mean, the idea of 14 billion years is not something which has any kind of sensible meaning to us.
Easy to say.
But it doesn't mean anything. I mean, in the sense that you can't imagine. It's hard enough to imagine a billion in any kind of a billion as $1 billion, in terms of it. To imagine 14 billion years is actually, I don't think, it's like, for example, the Chinese saying, they talk about 10,000 years. It doesn't literally mean 10,000 years. It just means a very long time. And so from a human point of view, saying something is 14 billion years is almost making it kind of timeless in that sense. So the point I'm trying to make here is this, that different kinds, conceptions of time have different purposes. And because it doesn't make any difference to us whether the universe is 14 billion or 12 billion or 7 billion, it's still a long time. It doesn't affect us. We can suspend that. It doesn't follow from that anything follows for us. If you're a cosmologist, it makes a huge difference, because your other cosmologist friends will tell you you're wrong, and they'll write papers around telling you why you're wrong. But for ordinary people who are not cosmologists, it won't have any reason. And I think the same thing with the conception of eternity. It may work for some people, but we do things we do not because we're simply conscious of the timelessness of the divine, for example.
Ian Powell, what do you think? Do people live their lives differently if they have a belief in an afterlife, in an eternity?
I would think they do, and it will depend. It could be a dangerous, from an ordinary Australian point, it could be a dangerous difference, or it could be a wonderful difference, depending on what you think that eternity is. So just believing, it's a bit like believing in a God, that doesn't tell you almost anything about how the person will live or behave. It depends what those three letters signify. For me, as without boring you the whole story, having been a happy atheist until I was about 19, when I took seriously that there was an eternity, and although I was deliciously happy living as an atheist, and then having been persuaded by a block of evidence that I was wrong, and that there was an eternity, and to realise that unless Jesus Christ was completely wrong about everything he said about himself and about life, I was heading into a very grim eternity. So my whole life transition was determined by facing that reality. It doesn't sort of fill my head every day, and the grimness of that alternative doesn't cause me any angst at all as a Christian, knowing that it's been thoroughly dealt with. I'm not living with any fear of hell now, but it does motivate me in terms of how I treat friends and people I love who may not be ready to face that event.
What about how you treat your enemies?
Well, I treat my enemies in the only way that as a Christian I'm allowed to, which is to love them. And even because that's one of the few really distinctive bits of Jesus' teaching compared to the earlier prophets. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who mistreat you. I don't think when I'm confronted with an enemy, which is very rare, but when I have been with a person who I would think of as an enemy, it's not so much eternity, it's so much the fact that this is what God is like. He is the lover of his enemies. He dies for his enemies, and this is what I as a Christian do. So that's more in terms of that's what it means to be a Christian.
Professor Sayyid, the question back on you. How do you treat your enemies?
I try to treat my enemies justly and respect them for being my enemies, but I'm not sure I follow into the question about loving them in a sense that you mean. I want them to stop being my enemies, and that's the first thing. I want to try and make them not my enemies.
Back to you. You have written a book about death, which is in itself an unusual thing for an atheist to do.
It should be the fundamental duty of every atheist to do, shouldn't it? I mean, this is our big weakness. We do badly on death.
In your book, you do actually mention, in some research that you've done, that people who believe in an afterlife actually are happier.
That's right. And that's, I think, logical with everything I've said, that failure to have a consolation of the afterlife in the face of death is, not a great ad for atheism. And in an earlier session mentioned Ernst Becker, who sort of took an opposite view to Freud. So, these two Jewish show-offs. I'm from a Jewish background. So Freud said, essentially, we can't deny death. Denial leads to the emergence of... Denial of pain leads to its emergence in other ways if we repress it. Whereas Becker, and I'm a bit more like Becker, says we spend all our life avoiding and denying death, and denial's a good thing. And we deny it sometimes in the way we strive for achievement, so we leave a legacy. We deny it in the way we procreate, and we deny it in the way we avoid conversing about it. And that's probably a healthy and human thing to do. And part of that denial may be the acquisition of a belief in the afterlife.
So it's a crutch.
I think people who use it merely as a transparent crutch fail to sustain that belief in the longer term. You can't fabricate belief like that. That's my view. You've got to be like Powell over there. You got to have a genuine belief, and there is a dichotomy between sorts of believers, and there are those believers who have it for instrumental reasons, belief, and fabricate and manufacture belief for instrumental reasons. And then there are people...
Like?
Well, people who want to go to church to get within a social group, who want to go to church and say they're Christians for a political advantage. And there are people who have a complicated and genuine belief. You know, I don't want to suck up to the City Bible Forum, but clearly they have that sort of belief because they're happy to converse with atheists and Muslims and a questioning belief. So that if you try to, I imagine, and like I've been in, you know, my life would be easier if I had a belief. There have been times, particularly in my young life, where I wished I could believe, but I couldn't. And if I fabricated a belief, it would be a disaster. I imagine it would be just frustrating. You know, I'd end up going to church or synagogue week after week, finding it frustrating, unconvincing. You know, you've got to be genuine about something that is as demanding as belief.
So it might not be fabricated, but is that belief in heaven perhaps just a way to avoid the realities of life? If there's sickness, if there are hardships in life, is it a genuine hope that there's something else? Is it an avoidance of life?
Well, I find as a minister, you do quite a lot of funerals, and I think I understand, but I find it deeply irritating the way ordinary Australians speak about death. I mean, I love them, but there's it's foolish. They'll say things like, well, you know, he's better off, I'm sure Uncle so-and-so's up there in heaven having a beer.
Yeah.
I mean, even at the atheist convention that Dick and I were both at, down in Melbourne, one of the guys on the platform actually spoke about Christopher Hitchens smiling down there. I think, seriously? Like, there's a lot of talk that happens which is just nonsense. Well, I think, for me, and the thing that Dick said earlier, and I want to recommend his book, by the way. I brought 3 books down with him from Sydney. One you can guess, the other was the Becker book, which is I'm reading now, and Dick's book on death, it's a great read and it's well written.
You got to buy it. I'm not going to schlep it back to Melbourne. This afternoon I sold one, and that was a pity purchase.
We're locking the door. But
I sort of cornered them over there, and you know they had to buy it.
But Dick made the point before about, you know, he doesn't believe in eternity, but it might be there. And I think the question is, what's real? It doesn't matter whether I like it or don't like it. Reality and being mature is about saying there are certain things that are true. I don't like AIDS, but it's true. You better live, you know, taking awareness of that. I don't like the teaching. I don't like the idea of hell, but I believe in it purely because Jesus does. And I believe what Jesus says about eternity because I was reluctantly convinced that he was not a liar. The claims he made about being the Son of God, which the people who executed him say in their writings, they'll tell you that's what he claimed to be, and that's why they executed him. It's very clear that he didn't claim to be an enlightened man or prophet or anything like that. I hang it all on him. I'm persuaded, and he believes in hell. He's the qualified expert in a way that none of us are. He believes that there is a heaven which is not like a giant Club Med. The essence of heaven is being in the direct presence of God Almighty. And so one of the early Christians said that speaks about he longs to die and be with Christ, but he understands he needs to stay on the earth to do good work, hard work, to make a difference. So that's my understanding of what eternity is like, and that's why I believe in it. And if he's wrong, I'm completely in the dark.
There is a downside of, perhaps a belief in eternity, a heaven or a paradise. People do crazy things in the name or the hope of ending up in a paradise or a heaven. For example, and I hate to raise the Islamic extremists because every religion has its extremist view, but there are those extremists who fly planes into buildings in the hope for a better afterlife.
I don't think they do that because they hope for a better life.
An afterlife? You don't think they're wanting to be in paradise?
I don't think that's the reason why you do that. I think that's. I think one of the issues we have is, in a sense, trying to understand why people do things that we would not normally do. But often people do things because they feel that they have reason to do that. Take, for example, the case of Chechnya, which is quite a good one. 1/3 of the population of Chechnya has been displaced, 1/3 of it has been killed. So that means to say, if you put in this room, if you look around you, the 2 people next to you, the 3 people, have actually been affected by the Russian invasion here. Now, what does that actually do, that brutalization? What does that actually do in terms of what you want to do?
Why have we said nothing about that, of course? Why have we said nothing about that?
I think, well, that's another issue.
We'll leave that for another day.
We'll leave it for another day. But I'm just trying to say, it seems to me that if you are in a situation of extreme danger, extreme threat, you may decide to take certain kinds of actions. Now, the Russian government said the reason why the Chechens are fighting us is because they believe they will go to heaven. And what we'll do, we'll incinerate their bodies so that way they'll never go to heaven. But that did not, stop any of the fighting, because that's not what religion's about. Because you can't... The idea that people's belief is something like a computer program that you can twist it around and it'll make people behave in a different way, I don't think it follows. If you look at Christianity's history, at certain points it was incredibly pacifist for faith. Where would Christianity be without the blood of its martyrs? At other points it was a very militant faith. It was actually, so it's not that there's one particular Christianity. At different points, Christianity responded to different kinds of pressures. Similarly, I think the idea of the afterlife, and I think it's the point that Ian made at the beginning, is the same thing with the idea of God. You can argue that the idea of God, and a lot of atheists make the point, why is there so much trouble in the world? It's all religious. But actually, if you look at people of faith, rarely do they discuss or dispute nowadays differences in theology as being a cause for anything else. It seems to me quite often what you're talking about is religion is a language that people express certain kinds of their most cherished or their most sacred beliefs. It doesn't self-tell you anything. Like any language, it doesn't predict what you're going to say. It gives you a way of saying it. Now, similarly, for example, you can believe in God and feel that that entitles you to be aggressive. You can believe in God and feel that it entitles you to be humble. And often it's the same God, and it may in fact be the same person at different points in their life, even. So from the idea that you believe in God leads to X, Y, Z, doesn't follow. Often you get very kind of unthinking atheists saying, well, religion causes all the wars, but then you can say, well, if you look at the record of the last 100 years, atheist regimes have actually killed a lot more people. But you get this sort of stupid kind of calculus, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. So I'm not sure whether being an atheist or believing in the afterlife tells you much more about communities and society's actions. It's not about action of individuals. It's about how people kind of respond to certain kinds of hardships.
Ian Powell?
Well, I wouldn't know quite, of all the stuff that's just been said since last I opened my mouth, what particular comment on it? Can you help me specify?
Does someone's action not really do people not respond in a certain way because of what they believe? You're saying people can have all sorts of responses.
I agree with the professor that there's no easy. They believe, that they wear this tribal marker, this ethnic marker. Therefore, they will do this. I think you can say that. As I understand human beings, we do act on the things that we believe most deeply. So I would say that most Australians are not. It's obvious most Australians are not atheists, but I think many Australians live as practical atheists. They may as well be atheists in a sense, in terms of the way that they make the decision about how to treat a business deal, how to use the weekend, etc. But I think in the end, like the professor mentioned rightly, there have been times when Christians have been quite militant. I think the question is, as a Christian, what does his teaching and example lead me to do? There are times when it's a bit like Beethoven. You don't judge Beethoven by his piano sonata being played by some idiot who can't play it. You at some stage you need to go back to the score, and I think I think the closer my challenge as a Christian, personally, and as a Christian minister, is for myself to live genuinely in the light of what Jesus says, and to help others to do that.
But the difficulty I would have with that, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is that those you disagree with, Christians you disagree with, will often say the same thing, that they are actually living in the light of Jesus, that they are actually doing what they were sanctioned by Jesus. Now, either you claim, and I can see why they've got it wrong, and there's a dispute about which is the correct Jesus, but there are enough people who would say, well, actually, what my reading of Jesus is correct, and yours is wrong.
Well, just briefly, that's obviously a good point. But I've lived a very limited life, like we all have, really. And when I speak to Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians, any of them who are serious about it, they all believe in the same basic lifestyle. We may do things differently in church. We may sing different hymns, etc., etc. But we all know that life is about loving your neighbour. It's all about loving your enemy. It's all about being forgiven. I've not found any Christian who disagree with that. Now, there were one or two moments in history, and they haven't been all that often, frankly. They get blown up. I mean, I was brought up on the view that Christian history consisted of something about Jesus and then the Crusades, Inquisitions and the killing of witches. That was basically 2,000 years of history covered in those three things. But I simply don't meet Christians who make any attempt to look at what Jesus says and take him seriously, who believe life's any different. Then what people throw up of various positions to Christianity, they'll throw up things like, what about the Oklahoma bombing? I've heard atheists and I've heard an Islamic spokesman, I've contacted him to let him know I've made a mistake. They say, well, the Oklahoma bomber was a Christian. He wasn't. He actually wrote in the local paper the week before he died that he was not a Christian, that he was an agnostic at best. But there's an attempt to say that there are Christians who go around bombing things, and they're just the examples I've heard anyhow. And the Christian church, when it got involved in the Crusade, which is a complicated response to a complicated set of stuff, I'm not in favour of it. I'm a mad Protestant. We were the first ones to give a sustained critique of the Crusades. But I think the use of violence or whatever is clearly, anyone who knows anything about Jesus and the sayings that Jesus knows, that violence has no place at all with the real Jesus. And I don't think there's any argument with people about that.
I don't think it matters. I could agree with you or disagree with you about that, and I wouldn't want to do that. It seems to me that what I would be cautious about saying is something like this, that the monopoly of virtue is held by only a certain set of people. Now, you said, for example, that for practical purposes, Australians are atheists. So what does that mean in our everyday dealing? Could I tell if an Australian is an atheist, are they more likely to defraud me? Are they more likely to cheat on their taxes? I'm not sure there's actually a strong enough correlation for that. Because it seems to me what we're talking about is really... people are very, very ingenious in being able to justify what they do through the language that there is available to them. And this is why I think it's better to think of religion, or more useful to think of it, not as a system of beliefs that governs, like a computer program, what we do, but really a language to which we justify our deepest hopes and fears and how we actually express ourselves through that language. And sometimes that language resonates with us, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think the example of Beethoven is quite good, in a way. It's not that we just we want Beethoven to be played with a competent pianist, for example, but there's also a sense in which whether it helps us, makes our spirit soar, or it doesn't. And that is no kind of particular reason for that. And I can't think you would want to say something like, well, Mozart is better than Beethoven. You may have preferences, but it's not something we could sort out with any kind of empirical evidence.
I think we can, though, with medicine, though. We can say some treatments work and some don't. And I do think, in the end, well, I agree with you on the music entirely, that, how you discuss what art is better than another. Who knows? I think it is personal preference. But I think there are things that are true and real, and there are things that are false. Now, we may not be able to work out what they are, but I think, so when Dick says, when we're all dead, some of us will be right and some of us won't. As Dick says, if in the end, that's what I was going to say. If Dick's right and there may be nothing after death, we won't know. But there are all of the other configurations we will know in terms of whether it's reincarnation or whatever. And I think the question is to work out, rather than shrug our shoulders and say no one knows, which is what I think we generally do, is to say, well, there are one or two outstanding candidates who claim to be there's only one who makes the ridiculous claims Jesus does, and it's worth, at some stage, using our God-given brains to look at the surrounding evidence.
Let's bring it back to the topic of eternity and proof. What is the proof that there is or there is not an eternity, Dick?
Well, we live in a scientifically informed world, so we generally if we don't formally adopt scientific method, we generally try to look for evidence. We try to, make
So is there
prognostications. Well, I start with my analysis like this. First of all, I look at some of the portrayals of heaven in art, and it's heaven's up there and hell's down there, and we've got satellites and we have planes, and it hasn't appeared on the radar yet, and we've dug huge holes in the ground in search of minerals and energy, and hell hasn't sort of appeared there, although it is warmer down there than. So that's very cheap and cheap evidence, but it's sort of the evidence I rely on. And then I look at the nature of the post-mortal existence as has been portrayed by various people. Do souls ascend into heaven, or are we? Do we revive our body and keep the body and soul together? The first point I would make about that is that there are two portrayals of life after death which are mutually exclusive. Either the soul and the body are revived and revivified together, as occurred with Jesus, or is the soul and the body separated and a disembodied soul goes elsewhere and to heaven or wherever the soul goes to? So I say that there are two post-mortal narratives. With the one about the disembodied soul, I can't believe in a disembodied soul because I see the personality as being inevitably linked to the brain, and a disembodied life without eyes, ears, mouth to communicate would be isolated and appalling. So I don't get any consolation from saying my soul goes to some place, and then I ask myself, well, if the soul and the body are resurrected together, can I believe in that? And I say that that's too hard to believe. And I sort of think that the way we deal with the dead cadaver indicates the extent to which we hold that belief. So the Egyptians had a very strong belief in the afterlife, and so they were into mummification. Whereas we bury the bodies for obvious sanitary reasons, and we burn bodies similarly for sanitary reasons. So it sort of makes the whole idea of resurrection very difficult for me to embrace. So on the basis of that empirical evidence, I can't see heaven, can't see hell, and on the basis of that logical discussion that a disembodied soul or a resurrected body and soul don't persuade me, I come to my position of lack of belief.
There was a question from the floor earlier today which is along these lines, and Ian, Powell, I might get you to address this initially, just in a nutshell if you can. How does one make a logical argument for the concept of eternity? So once again, it's another way of saying, where's the proof? What's the logical argument?
I don't think the concept of eternity, either as timelessness or outside of time, is incoherent at a philosophical level. It might be difficult, might strain the brain, but lots of things strain the brain. But I think, to go back, if I've heard that question properly, in terms of evidence, logically for it, where Jesus hangs his hat twice, once in Matthew 12 and once in John 2, Jesus specifically asks, give us some proof. And both times he points to his resurrection. Tear apart this body, in 3 days' time I'll rebuild it. And then the early apostles, the earliest bit of Christian writing we've got is a letter to this church at Corinth, and the apostle there is dealing in a very Jesus-like way with the fact that really if life is just, if this is all there is, we may as well eat, drink and be merry. That we may as well in the end embrace as much pleasure as we possibly can. which is a fair enough thing to do, but he then says, but we know that Jesus has been raised, and he speaks about, if he has not been raised, we are of all men most to be pitied. Your faith is worthless, and we are liars about God, because we have testified. I mean, it's very hard-headed, Christianity. And then the evidence is in terms of just to put what I think would take a little bit more time. Something happens to the early Christians. Every single other Messianic movement in Palestine under the Romans dissolved without trace once the Messiah was crucified, as they were. Christianity peculiarly is a very small movement, and
that is the big mystery.
And goes nuts after he dies. The body is missing, and you've got a bunch of Jews, because all the first Christians were Jews, proclaiming that Jesus is risen from the dead. It is without precedent in the ancient world. If you're an internet user, you'll know that there are many precedents. It's rubbish in terms of history, in terms of the ancient history department. The Jews believed in only resurrection at the end of history. You've suddenly got this guy in the middle of history. The Greeks despised the idea of resurrection. They weren't interested in the body. So you've got a brand new idea, a bunch of ordinary nobodies who are unstoppable and who, without lifting a sword or killing a soul, slowly through argument and love and prayer, win the ancient world. They get nasty, like everyone gets nasty when they're in power. But Christianity for the first 300 years was at the end of the sword. It never lifted a sword. And the question is why? And I think as I played with the various logical possibilities to explain the missing body, this transformed group of people, the man of Jesus, in the end, in a sense, the option with the least difficulties is that something very unusual happened in the midst of history, and that is Jesus. That's what he hangs his hat on, and that's where I hang my hat with him. That's the evidence.
Well, I mean, I think the question really asks for what is the logical argument for eternity, and I'm kind of like slightly concerned, only because if I said to you, what's the last number? I don't think, you probably couldn't imagine it, no one can, but nor would you imagine that it's impossible. But at the same time, it is something that completely defies anything. You could say whatever it is, and I could say, what about after that? And it seems to me that if we can imagine it something which is infinite, then it seems to me that the imagining of eternity is something that is beyond human, or beyond human comprehension. It doesn't require much more than an active imagination. I think the problem comes is when we get bogged down in literality, and we expect religious texts and religious things to speak to us like a newspaper would or a history book would. And I'm not sure that's the best way to do that. So, for example, Dick, when you graciously said this thing about looking for heaven and hell below and above is kind of cheap shot, but it's one that's quite often the common currency of a certain kind of crass atheism. But it doesn't really advance the argument very much, because what it doesn't really take into account is that if you have a description of a flower by a biologist and you have a description of a flower by a poet, there's no point in saying that one is the right description and the other one is, so the one with the biologist is the right description and the other one isn't. Those descriptions are useful for their own purposes. And like I said, if on Valentine's Day you just get a formula for a rose, or you get a rose yourself, I think most people would appreciate one or the other. So I think for that reason, maybe the questions that we're asking of religion shouldn't be the questions which are simply informed, as Dick mentioned, by science, because that's only one particular kind of experience. And there are more useful questions to ask, and there are more useful questions for us to be through religion. And that, I think, where the argument for the infinite comes through.
Yeah, but the Pope recently said, well, heaven isn't a geographic place, and then went on to make a formulation about the afterlife, which I just found impossible to understand, impossible to find consolation in, and impossible to imagine. Because
But that says something about your imagination?
Well,
we can imagine aliens. We can imagine all kinds of things. But for example, the
no, I think that's.
But what I wanted to say,
I think that's a cheap shot, because I think that when you're talking about a concept that's supposed to be of relevance and meaning to people, it has to be within their comprehension. If they can't understand it, if you read the formulation, 15 times and you still don't get it, and in the end you think it's just a lot of gobbledygook, then that's not a failure. That's blaming the victim to say that it's my lack of
No, I didn't mean it to you particularly, but it does seem to me that I agree with you that concepts should make certain kinds of sense. But we go through life, a lot of dealing with concepts that we just don't make sense of. For example, anyone who's ever worked an iPad, how many people actually know how it works? It just does, and we know what to press. We have certain kind of practices on it. We don't have to understand it. I'm sure there are people who understand how it might work. I don't understand it. But it seems to me that what you're saying...
No, but we have evidence. We use the iPad. It works as a calculator. It works. We have evidence because we've used it for email. We actually have evidence that it works, and that's on the base. So our belief and faith is based on evidence that we've got this little tablet and it works.
Well, there's a line from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy which basically says that evidence denies faith. So in a sense, if you have to have faith, it has to be in spite of evidence.
Yeah.
I think that's quite true.
All right. We're going to take some questions from the floor as well. If anyone has written down a question, there will be a blue box coming up. If you could put them in there, that would be great. There was a question from the floor earlier, and it's actually directed at you, Professor Sayyid, if I may. And the question is, do Muslims really believe in 72 virgins in heaven? What about a devout woman, and what does she get if she gets to heaven?
I think the main problem with all of these things is that the word used in the Quran is huri, which means can mean companion. How then people then describe these things when you translate from one language to another, how you translate not just in terms of language but in terms of different kind of value systems. It becomes very, very complicated to read that. So, for example, I've only been in Australia for 18 months. The concept and category of mate was very straightforward for me. It just meant friend, but here there's a whole literature about it. There's a whole kind of sense of the meaning.
Is that right?
Well, it seems to me there's a whole sense of the way that word is used, which I'm not aware of, how it's used in English. So I think there are lots of different ways that things are kind of used in that. Now,
I think you got bad press out of the reporting of that.
Of what?
Of 9/11 and the fate in paradise with all those virgins.
I was talking about the concept of the word mate, the Australian concept of the word mate, like mateship and things like that. That's what I was talking about.
So the definition of the 72 virgins has been lost in translation?
No, I don't think it's lost in translation. I think to say lost in translation means there's a correct. There's the concept that they talk about in the Quran is huri, which often some people. Well, there's a non-Muslim guy who thinks that the Quran is written in a lost language, says it means white raisins. Some people mean that it means companion. So it seems to me that's the first thing. The thing about 72 is against one of those numbers that people use to express lots of numbers. It gets raised in a way to explain something which people don't want to find explanations for in the actions that they do. They don't want to understand things politically, so they try and understand them theologically and cosmologically. So you don't understand conflicts are caused by reasons that people have differing views about how things should be. You try and find reasons which are based upon theological or cosmological reasoning.
So that definition of what awaits in paradise is correct? Incorrect? Or we can't boil it down?
There is a sense in which paradise is described in a very sort of in language which talks about, for example, the land. Take a Christian thing, the land of milk and honey. Now, when you're a child, you actually think, it's a biblical thing. So.
I claim that.
All right, it's a biblical thing, land of milk and honey. Now, when I was a child, when I heard that phrase, I actually imagined literally there would be rivers running with milk and honey. I'm sure that's not necessarily the case, and the absence of rivers running with milk and honey doesn't deviate that. It's simply a language to explain something. And I think those are the kind of... If you're trying to talk about something which is infinite and beyond human experience, that you have to resort to a human language to try and approximate that, then you're constantly using metaphors to try and get closer to that meaning. But those metaphors themselves are being changed because human understanding of language itself constantly changes as well.
So
And the metaphors will inevitably reflect the inadequacies that people perceive. So the Jewish heaven, as I understand it, is full of lots of water because it's a desert. You know, a desert was a problem, so there's running water everywhere. In their rituals, there's a lot of running water and hand washing. And so I imagine that other formulations of heaven are similarly informed by what are people missing out on, and the metaphor would try to deal with what they can get.
In your book, Dick, Death by Elegy, you actually make that point that heaven is constantly shifting, the definition is shifting to fit the longings of society that it serves. Are you basically once again saying that people are just longing for something they don't have and that'll change depending on what they're up to? So it's a fantasy in their mind, a hope, a wishful thinking for something they don't have now.
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with having aspirations, longings and hopes. You know, atheists are pretty bad on hope. You know, we're almost as bad on hope as we are on death. And so I sort of try to not condemn hope. I try not to condemn longing to repair. You know, Ian and I were talking about Psalm 23 at lunch, which is a beautiful hope, aspiration, poem, whatever it is. It's hard to criticise.
Is there anything wrong in hoping for an afterlife?
Well, the main thing wrong with me is that it's one that I can't adopt. So if it's all about me, then, you know, I can't believe it. So, and then the other thing that could be wrong about it, and, you know, I don't want to be the killjoy here and condemn other people's beliefs, you know. There's enough of that condemnation around the world. It could have a number of adverse impacts in terms of the way people deal with death, the way people forgive indiscretions. It could be a good thing if it inspires goodness and holiness. But it's not something that I can believe in, and I'm open to persuasion, but, you know, and I reserve the right to change my mind.
All right. I've got a few questions here that I'll look through in a moment. Is there anyone here who would actually like to ask a question of anyone in the panel? Yes.
The guy that straps a bomb to his chest and goes out, I suspect, genuinely believes he's going to get the 72 virgins.
Seriously?
Now, is that because he's been told, or is he completely misled?
But why do you say that? I mean, are you trying to say that every instance of use of suicide is motivated by that? So do the kamikaze pilots believe in 72 virgins? Do the Tamil tigers believe in 72 virgins? I don't think it's necessary. One thing is to say that this is an act, it's been committed by these people. And then one thing to say is that they're motivated because of their belief in a particular aspect of afterlife.
Can I come to the assistance of the Islamic side of things in this? I think that there have been suicide people since time immemorial. It's usually related to extraordinary despair. In Jesus' time, there were the zealots, who had a very strong suicidal approach to their conflict with Rome, and they had the cross as their symbol. You know, like the Christians, you know, laughing in the face of death, or fortitude in the face of death. We talk about the kamikazes. They were a secular suicide movement. although, you know, the emperor had sort of semi-divine status, it was, you know, a whole lot of young men careless with their own lives in a hothouse atmosphere, trying to do the right thing by a close peer group. I mean, you know, you get a similar conversation in football sheds every Saturday. You know, it's all about sacrifice, duty, loyalty, group ethic. And I think that with the suicidal things, you know, I think that I actually believe that a belief in an afterlife must have played a part. But I suspect actually it was a small part. And, you know, my sense is that desperation, despair, loyalty, group dynamics, shocking groupthink, shocking and appalling cohesiveness within the group led to what I think are ridiculous decisions. And we saw that, sorry to just keep on, but there was this poor guy in Indonesia who was arrested, and he was about to be arrested and he went on the run. And he gave himself up, and he gave himself up because he missed his family. And I thought, you know, you're about to be a suicide bomber. Aren't you going to miss your family more? And what I took from that is that the rationality in these decisions is not great. The social environment is very powerful. The belief in the afterlife is there, but I suspect it's not huge.
And that's essentially what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many, many instances of people, for example, fighting against incredible odds, which will certainly lead to their demise and death.
That's right.
You know, and we then don't simply say this is because they're motivated by the promise of 72 virgins, because there may be many, many reasons. And I think some of the reasons you mentioned are prominent there. When we, for example, take the Spartans in Thermopylae, they knew they were going to die. They didn't have a belief in the afterlife, as in the sense that we do, sensibly. Yeah. They had various other kinds, and there are many, many examples of that. Sometimes people do things which seem to be counterintuitive and counter to their own interest, but they do them for some higher purpose, which maybe is no more than protecting their family, their friends, or their own sense of themselves.
The only thing I'd say, which has always mystified me, was that in the 9/11 group, there were a lot of quite middle-class Saudis, I understand.
But why is that mystifying to you?
Because they're a part of the world that isn't suffering from despair.
But I think it's
that's often associated, in my mind, with the...
Yeah, I don't think despair necessarily takes the point. I mean, for example, you often talk about... despair isn't simply about deprivation. Despair can come from many different causes.
I know, but I accept all of that. It just surprises me. I mean, I completely understand why Chechens would do it, but these weren't Chechens. These were often educated. They were reported as being educated.
Can I?
It just mystifies me. I don't condemn it.
I'm not just saying. I'm surprised that it mystifies you.
Yeah.
Along those lines, someone in the audience has asked for you, Professor, to be pinned down in a more concrete way on how the Islamic faith understands the concept of eternity, rather than just vagaries, as they put it here. What exactly does Islam say about eternity?
I think, I'm sorry that they think it's vagary, but I mean, I think what is... Firstly, what I'm telling you is what I'm informed by a certain kind of understanding of it. I don't think there is any point in saying, well, there is one particular version of Islamic faith which says this is what it is. Mm-hmm. This is faith of 1.5 billion people, perhaps. It's been around for 1,400 years, so there are many kind of different kind of arguments. The idea that I was trying to say to you, and I don't even know how you can be concrete about the infinite. How can you be concrete about the majesty of death? It seems to me this is a kind of a demand for us to be positivist and to demand us to follow the kind of scientific model of knowing, which is not the only model of knowing. So in terms of what Islam says about the infinite, it simply describes it as something beyond human reach. It seems to describe it as something that is not knowable. It's something which transcends what is to be human. Now, in that, it uses various kinds of metaphors at various points, and those metaphors then become themselves a part of a hermeneutical tradition which tries to understand those metaphors. But it seems to me what it is trying to do...
But they're only a means to an end.
The hermeneutical tradition is only a means to an end. It's a means of trying to concretize what those metaphors
But
mean.
I see you guys as saying very similar things about eternity. And, I think they're very sophisticated formulations. I don't criticise them. I think they're sophisticated. They go into very challenging ideas. And I think that you're describing the indescribable. It's hard to... If I ask you to make it more concrete, that's sort of like oxymoronic. And I actually think that and it's no surprise because you're both from Abrahamic traditions, that the Christian and the Muslim were very similar in...
We are basically talking about Mesopotamian stories and reworking them in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any...
And that's fair enough, I reckon.
Just let Ian
And I
speak.
disagree completely with what the Professor's just said there. I don't think we are at all. It can be described like that, and I've got friends who describe it like that. I just think it's to misunderstand to read the Gospels, and there is nothing like the Gospels in the Quran. That's not a pejorative comment on the Quran. There is nothing like the sort of the concrete saying he slept there, he went there, he was hungry here, he was whipped here, he was etc. etc. He died there. The women went to the tomb, etc. etc. As I understand it, there are great similarities between some of Islamic at its source and at its best thought, and some of Christian speak at its source and at its best, which makes sense, I think, looking at the history, I think, particularly of Islam, coming where it does in history. But, as I understand it, and I've been working on this for some decades, I'm not pretending I'm an expert, I've been reading the earliest biography of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq, and I've been reading the Quran. I don't read Arabic, obviously, and I've been reading the Hadiths, and I've been reading academic Muslim biographies of Muhammad. And there are parallels, but the huge differences I can see it in the view of the forever is that the Muslim goes to a situation like the Islamic understanding of the Garden of Eden, which is very different from the Hebrew understanding. The essence of the Garden of Eden story in the Old Testament is that God walks with Adam and Eve. In the garden, according to the Islamic sources, Adam was in paradise, but he was not with God. It is impossible in classical Islamic thinking for humans to directly interact with God like that. He's simply too transcendent. And the essence of paradise for the Christian is that the one who has come amongst us in Jesus and has loved us and died for us, we will be with him. God will be with his people. This is a great theme in the Old Testament, the temple, etc., etc. And so when Muhammad retells, or the Quran retells the stories, some of the Jewish stories, what's missing all the time is God dwelling with his people. So the essential difference in the paradise is that one is deeply personal. It's fundamentally about being with God face to face. And the last thing I'll say is when I've been reading the sources, trying to understand that metaphor is an incredibly important part of all human discourse. We use it all the time, even without thinking. But I think the Quran does repeatedly, and in the speeches of Muhammad is recorded in the Hadiths as well, and in the earliest biography. It's very difficult to take a metaphorical view of the conversation about the earthly pleasures. It's in the New Testament where you find statements like, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what the mind of man cannot perceive. That is what God has prepared for those who love him. So you get those sort of disclaimers in the New Testament. I've not found anything
No,
You do in later
Ian,
No, I think that's. I mean, I would say to you that the Quran is actually replete with metaphors, but also admonishments saying you cannot understand the majesty of God because the majesty of God is so transcendent.
Absolutely, but about the paradise,
I think even
it's
the
quite,
question of
it's
paradise.
quite concrete.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. We've got so many more questions, and I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions too. But we are out of time, and maybe...
Are we giving up now?
Not giving up. I was going to suggest maybe we can come talk to you afterwards.
Oh, okay.
So you've got more in store. Thank you, everyone. Please thank our guests, Professor Sayyid, Ian Powell, and Dick Ross.
Could you please thank Anita? That's a hard job.